Welcome to Easy Watercolor Magic for Beginners, Easy Florals. I'm Laura Watmough from Hidden Talent Art School. For the last 25 years, I've specialized in coaching beginners and experienced artists to create amazing artwork they never thought possible, even if you are scared stiff and cannot draw stick men. To encourage you to celebrate Alberta Culture Days in a hands-on creative way, please enjoy this free floral watercolor lesson. Let's discover the artist in you. I will introduce you to various skills and techniques that you can easily master and get to feel the excitement and fun of painting with watercolors. We will learn about painting petals, wet on wet, wet on dry, and lifting, glazing, layering, and tweaking, stylus detail on leaves, and how to create rich dark backgrounds that sparkle. How to use these lessons. Before you start painting, watch the entire video. Gather and set up all your supplies, download the flower reference photo and the line drawing. Securely tape your watercolor paper onto a hard surface. Start by scribbling graphite on the back of the line drawing. Place the line drawing right side up on your watercolor paper. Next, attach the top of the line drawing to the watercolor paper. Take your stylus and lightly and carefully go over the drawing. From time to time, lift the paper to check that you are using enough pressure. Your drawing will be considerably lighter than mine. Any red or pink watercolor you choose for the flower will be the right one. We will not exactly match the color of the photo. I'm mixing my pink for the peony color and then I'm adding a bit of blue because if I look at my reference photo, I can see that some petals have more light. Adding a bit of blue to the pink will make the color in the shadow areas. I'm using a small amount of cobalt blue. Ultramarine blue will also work. Petals, wet on wet. Wet paint on wet paper. Select and wet petals that do not touch each other so that the colors don't run between them. Carefully place generous amounts of water on each petal. Let it soak into the paper for nice soft transitions and no hard edges. Start painting when the sheen on the petal is gone. Start with the shadow color. Make your petal darker or lighter. Depends on how thick the paint is and how much water is on the paper. The paint can be less mixed on a wet on wet because the colors in the petal blend softly together to give a more organic coloring. I have decided to do the purplish or shadow petals first. As long as the petal shape is wet, you can manipulate the paint within the shape. As soon as the petal starts to dry, it will be harder to push the paint around. You must stop then and let the petal dry completely. Then you may start again by wetting the petal shape. Petals, wet paint on dry paper. Wet on dry paper is used to paint a darker color or accent parts of a shape. Use wet, juicy, not dry paint that is deep in color. Start with the darkest part of the petal. Use that juicy paint and try to always leave a wet edge to work from. This prevents lines within the shape. This way you can leave a dark color in a crevice and then spread out and lighten the rest of the petal by adding a slight amount of water. I am using mostly round brushes for this painting. Some of the brushes I am using are clear. They are meant to be filled with water, and as you squeeze the handle, the water goes through the tip of the brush, making your paint lighter. With this painting, I have not filled the inside with water. I am just trying out the nylon bristles of this new brush. This video has been done at a faster speed than I actually paint. So remember, you can stop and start this video. Take your time. Dark crevice shapes are layered. They are painted, then repainted as many times as needed to get the right shade. Go back and forth between these two different techniques to paint the petals in shadow. Always check to see that the petals are dry so that the paints don't run into each other. This is especially important when you change colors. Wet the large pink petal. Use the wet on wet technique. It makes it easier to manipulate the paint. Add the darkest pink. To lighten the color as it goes towards the top edge of the petal, take a slightly drier brush with clear water and blend backwards towards the color. This will help to lighten the petal at the top while keeping edges from forming. These petals are being painted wet on wet. Another way to lighten the petal in a specific place is to paint the petal using the wet on wet technique. Use a thirsty brush to lift the color when the petals are still wet. A thirsty brush is a brush that is drier than the area you just painted. Simply place the brush on a paper towel to absorb some of the moisture. Place your thirsty brush on the wet petal and lift off and lighten the color. Glazing, adding a new color or the same color over dry paint. Next step is glazing. To make our shadow color in the petal richer, we are going to add a stronger pink over the shadow color in the petal. Because watercolor is transparent, the color underneath will mix with the color we are applying on top. Because watercolor dries about 30% lighter, I like to go back and repaint and emphasize my darks. They look lovely when they are wet, but when they dry, they look kind of wimpy. So it's an important thing to repaint the bits of dark so that they show up in the final painting. Now that the petals are dry, I will continue to paint the rest using the wet on wet, or the wet on dry, or the clear water, or the thirsty brush technique. Feel free to stop and review the video as you paint the petals along with me. I will be adding more layers to these petals later on. To create depth, it is important to layer your colors as opposed to try with a dark the first time. Remember, watercolors dry lighter. I'm constantly adjusting the colors once the painting has dried. I will have a better idea of which petal comes forward and which petal goes behind. How many layers does a watercolor need? Many artists have upwards of 20 layers on their paintings. The final layers are usually very tiny and quick to finish. The more important reason for tweaking is to see if your painting reads well. Does it make sense? Can you see each individual petal? Is there variety of color? Are my edges crisp? Reinforcing your darks gives the flower much more depth. For the interior of the flower, mix yellow ochre with a tiny bit of the petal pink to make a golden yellow-orange color. By painting in little circles, you will get a lot of variety of dark and light shapes. Darker colors towards the back of the center and just touching the front edge of the petals. When mixing your greens for leaves, add a slight bit of petal pink to make sure that they are the perfect match for your painting. Mix a warm green and a cool dark green. Use the wet on wet technique for your leaves. Wet the leaf with water, then add color. Let the color set up a bit. Take a stylus and actually draw the veins inside the leaf. Because you are pressing on wet paint and wet paper, this will create a groove that the paint falls into, and the veins will appear to be painted. This darker leaf has darker veins. It is painted directly. This means that wet juicy paint is applied to dry paper. Wait a few seconds and then take your stylus and make your veins. Continue to paint your leaves. Remember to use a variety of techniques and change up your colors by adding a little bit of yellow or a little bit of a different green. The center is dry enough to continue painting. Add more yellow color to deepen the color of the center, and again apply in circular strokes. Continue painting the leaves. Vary the color and the techniques. Time for another layer and more tweaking. A general watercolor rule is to save your whites and your lights and to deepen your darks. Another way to paint leaves is to use a long, narrow brush called a rigger and paint the veins on a dry leaf. Try to lift up at the end of your stroke for a more natural look. A dark, colorful background will highlight our flower. It is also an advantage that you can sculpt your leaves and change your leaf and flower shapes as you go. Combine phthalo blue with the petal pink you used. Another combo is Viridian, a cool green, mixed with phthalo blue or other blues to create a teal colored background. Test your color combos on a separate sheet before you start. To mix a very rich, thick and juicy paint, wet your watercolors with warm water. It is very important that you mix a lot of color. When we paint a background shape, you will need a lot of paint in order to keep the leading edge wet. If you don't use enough paint, the leading edge may dry before the rest of the background and leave a shape or an edge or a line. Try for a consistent level of moisture throughout the entire background. Approach painting the background as if you were washing a floor. Scoop up the paint with your brush. Start inside the wet area and carry it past the line made from the last stroke. Start with your smallest shape first so that you can get a hang of what you're doing. Remember, drag the fully loaded paintbrush and keep the wet edge. I'm using kosher salt. The thicker the paint, the sooner you can add salt and get the desired effects. Sometimes you need to wait for the paint to set up. You can tell if you're adding the salt at the correct time when the salt takes up the paint immediately. Sometimes if there is too much water, you will have to wait and then add the salt later in order for the crystals to absorb the paint. This is what makes the design. Make sure you have more paint than you think you actually need. Once the background is completely dry, brush off the salt crystals. Do not use a hairdryer. To finish the center, mix a tiny bit of green with yellow and pink to make the stem color that appears at the very bottom of the center next to the front petals. From the photo reference, you can see that there were a few spots of pink in the center. This was done with pink and gold, so the color wasn't too bright. The very last step after the center dried was to take a razor blade or utility knife and lift off a few dots of color to make white highlights. Here are some samples of water droplets on objects and on the ground. On white paper, draw a droplet. Add a beard. Wet the drop and paint blue on the top and keep it clear about halfway down. Paint the beard a slightly darker blue. Blow dry. Use a razor blade or utility knife and pick off the white highlights in the blue. Darken the blue slightly and carefully outline the drop. Re-wet the beard and have a slightly deeper color closer to the drop than to the end of the beard. That's all there is to it. Now let's try it on a colored background. With a stiff wet brush, remove the color from the bottom half of the drop. Dab with a paper towel. Paint the beard a transparent light blue so that the bottom color still is visible. Use a razor or utility knife to lift off the highlight. Remember to outline the drop with blue. It may take a bit of practice before this becomes automatic. Here are two finished projects, complete with water droplets. Thank you for joining me for this free watercolor lesson and to celebrate St. Albert's contribution to Alberta Culture Days. Feel free to join us on Facebook, Easy Watercolor Magic for Beginners, where you will find support, interact with me and others who are watercolor beginners. Also on Facebook, look for Hidden Talent Fine Art Schools page. This is where you can see the amazing artwork of the students of the Hidden Talent Art School. In fall, the classes will resume. Please check out hiddentalentartschool.com for details on watercolor and oil painting lessons.